name is Lena Brooks, and at 74 years old, I learned that love can be the cruelest illusion when it comes from someone who sees you as nothing more than an inconvenience. It was a Tuesday morning in October when I discovered exactly what my son Michael thought my life was worth. I was sitting at my kitchen table, carefully organizing my weekly pill dispenser, when I heard his key turning in my front door lock without so much as a knock or a greeting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The sound of multiple footsteps echoed through my hallway, and I looked up to see Michael striding into my kitchen, flanked by two women in navy blazers, carrying leather portfolios. They wore those practiced smiles that never quite reached the eyes, the kind I'd seen countless times in my professional life but never expected to encounter in my own home. One was tall, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the other was younger, with kind eyes that seemed genuinely apologetic for whatever was about to unfold. "Mom, we need to talk," Michael said, his voice carrying that tone he'd perfected in boardrooms, the one that suggested the conversation was already over before it began. He gestured toward the women as if presenting evidence in a case I didn't know I was defending. "This is Patricia Wells from Sunset Manor, and this is her assistant, Jennifer. They're here to help us with your transition." The word transition hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. I set down the small white pill I'd been holding and looked directly at my son, searching his face for some explanation that would make sense of this intrusion. Transition to what exactly? Patricia stepped forward with the confidence of someone who delivered this speech many times before. "Mrs. Brooks, your son has expressed some concerns about your safety living alone in such a large house. Sunset Manor is a beautiful assisted living community where you'll have access to 24-hour care, social activities, and the peace of mind that comes with knowing help is always nearby." I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I realized this wasn't a consultation or a discussion. This was a presentation of decisions that had already been made without me. "I haven't asked for help," I said quietly, my voice barely steady. I felt my hands begin to tremble, not from age or infirmity, but from a rage so pure it threatened to overwhelm me. "Without consulting me?" My voice came out sharper than I'd intended, and I saw Patricia and Jennifer exchange a glance that clearly said they'd witnessed this type of family drama before. "We're consulting you now," Michael replied, but his tone suggested the consultation was merely a formality. "The decision is what's best for everyone involved." Everyone involved. Not what was best for me, but for everyone, which clearly meant what was most convenient for him. I studied my son's face, looking for some trace of the boy who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms scared him, who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard and call them the most beautiful flowers in the world. That child had grown into a man who could arrange to have his mother institutionalized with the same casual efficiency he might use to schedule a business meeting. Patricia cleared her throat and opened her portfolio to reveal a stack of glossy brochures featuring smiling elderly people engaged in various activities. The images were bright and cheerful, designed to make assisted living look like an extended vacation rather than the end of independent life. "Why don't I show you some of the amenities and services we offer? I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by how modern and comfortable our facilities are." She spread the brochures across my kitchen table like a real estate agent displaying properties, pointing out features with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed she was offering me something wonderful. The dining room with its crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths. The fitness center with specialized equipment for seniors. The library with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a landscaped courtyard. Each image was carefully crafted to suggest dignity and grace, but all I could see were the invisible bars of a beautifully appointed cage. "Our residents particularly enjoy the social aspects of community living," Jennifer added, her voice warm with practiced sincerity. "Many of them tell us they wish they'd made the move sooner. The friendships they form and the activities they participate in really enhance their quality of life." I nodded politely while my mind raced, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening to me. Somewhere in the span of a few weeks, I had apparently been transformed from an independent woman managing her own household into a problem that needed to be solved through professional intervention. The speed of this transformation was breathtaking in its cruelty. Michael had moved to the window and was looking out at my backyard with an expression I recognized from his childhood, the one he wore when he was planning something he knew I wouldn't approve of. "The house is really too much for you now, Mom. The yard work alone is a full-time job, and you can't keep hiring teenagers to mow the lawn every week." I hired those teenagers twice a month, not every week, and I paid them well because I remembered what it was like to need extra money. More importantly, I hired them because I chose to, not because I was incapable of maintaining my own property. But I could see that facts were irrelevant in the narrative Michael had constructed about my declining abilities. "What happens to my house?" I asked, though I already suspected I knew the answer. Patricia and Jennifer looked at Michael, clearly recognizing that this was outside their purview. He turned from the window with the expression of someone delivering news he considered reasonable and practical. "We'll put it on the market. The proceeds will more than cover your care at Sunset Manor for several years, and anything left over will be set aside for additional needs as they arise." Several years. As if my life had been reduced to a finite number of years that could be calculated and budgeted for like any other expense. The casual way he discussed liquidating my life was perhaps more shocking than the original plan to move me to assisted living. This house wasn't just real estate to be converted into cash. It was where I'd raised him, where I'd nursed David through his final illness, where I'd celebrated birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday mornings for more than 4 decades. "I see," I said quietly, because there seemed to be nothing else to say. The decision had been made, the arrangements had been completed, and my role was apparently to accept the plan with grace and gratitude. Jennifer must have sensed my distress because she leaned forward slightly and spoke in the tone people use when they're trying to comfort a child. "Mrs. Brooks, I know this feels overwhelming, but change is often harder to anticipate than to actually experience. Once you're settled at Sunset Manor, I think you'll find it's quite comfortable. Many of our residents tell us they feel safer and more connected to their community than they did living alone. Safer, connected, community." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they felt like euphemisms for controlled, monitored, and confined. I understood that these women were probably good people, doing what they believed was their job, helping families navigate difficult transitions. But they couldn't possibly understand what it felt like to have your entire life rearranged by people who had decided your own judgment was no longer trustworthy. Michael checked his watch with the impatience of someone who had other appointments to keep. "Why don't you show Mom around the facility this afternoon? I think once she sees how nice it is, she'll feel better about the whole thing." Patricia nodded enthusiastically. "That's an excellent idea. We encourage family members to visit before move-in day, so they can familiarize themselves with the layout and meet some of our staff. Would 2 o'clock work for you, Mrs. Brooks?" I wanted to say that 2 o'clock wouldn't work because I had no intention of touring a facility I hadn't chosen, but the weight of their collective expectation was overwhelming. Michael was looking at me with barely concealed irritation, as if my hesitation was confirmation of the poor judgment that had necessitated this intervention in the first place. Patricia and Jennifer were smiling with professional patience, waiting for me to accept what they clearly viewed as an inevitable and beneficial change. "I suppose that would be fine," I heard myself say, my voice sounding hollow and distant. The words felt like a betrayal of everything I'd believed about my own autonomy, but I was rapidly learning that autonomy was apparently something that could be revoked without notice, when other people decided you were no longer capable of exercising it responsibly. The realization was both humiliating and terrifying, and I felt something inside me begin to harden in response. After they left, promising to see me at 2 o'clock for what Patricia called your orientation tour, I sat alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the glossy brochures they'd left behind. The silence felt different now, not peaceful, but ominous, as if the house itself understood that its days as my home were numbered. I picked up one of the brochures and stared at a photograph of a white-haired woman painting watercolors in what was presumably Sunset Manor's art studio. She looked content and purposeful, but there was something in her eyes that reminded me of animals in well-maintained zoos, comfortable but forever separated from the lives they'd once known. I walked through my house slowly, seeing it as if for the first time and possibly the last. The living room where David and I had watched countless movies together, his arm around my shoulders and a bowl of popcorn balanced between us. The den where Michael had built elaborate Lego cities as a child, spreading pieces across every available surface while I pretended to be annoyed by the mess. The master bedroom where I'd given birth to Michael during a snowstorm when the roads were too dangerous for a trip to the hospital, with only David and a terrified midwife to help us through. Every room held layers of memory so deep and complex that I couldn't imagine how they could be reduced to the simple transaction Michael was proposing. Sell the house, move to assisted living, use the proceeds to pay for care. It sounded reasonable and practical, which made it even more devastating. How do you explain to someone that a house isn't just an asset to be liquidated, but the physical container of everything that had made your life meaningful? I found myself standing in David's study, which I'd left largely unchanged in the 3 years since his death. His books were still arranged exactly as he'd preferred them, his reading glasses still folded on the desk next to a half-finished crossword puzzle I'd never had the heart to clear away. I sat in his leather chair and tried to imagine what he would say about Michael's plan to institutionalize me for my own good. David had always been protective of my independence, sometimes to a fault.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Even when he was dying, he'd insisted that I continue making my own decisions about everything from medical treatments to funeral arrangements, refusing to let his illness become an excuse for other people to take control of our lives. He would have been furious about this ambush in our kitchen, this assumption that I was no longer capable of determining what was best for my own future. But David wasn't here to be furious on my behalf, and I was discovering that outrage without power is just another form of helplessness. I could be as angry as I wanted about Michael's high-handed manipulation, but that wouldn't change the fact that he'd already put down a deposit on my new life and scheduled my orientation tour. The machine was in motion, and I was apparently expected to climb aboard with whatever dignity I could manage. The phone rang, and I almost didn't answer it, afraid it might be Patricia calling to confirm our appointment, or Michael calling to check on my emotional adjustment to the new plan. But when I glanced at the caller ID, I saw it was my neighbor Eleanor, who had been my closest friend since she and her husband moved in next door 15 years ago. "Lena, honey, is everything all right?" Her voice was tight with concern. "I saw Michael's car in your driveway with 2 other cars I didn't recognize, and then I saw him walking around your backyard like he was measuring it or something." I almost laughed at the accuracy of her observation. Michael probably had been measuring, mentally calculating square footage and market value while I sat inside being presented with brochures for my new life. "It's complicated, Eleanor. Michael thinks I need to move to assisted living." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I thought we might have been disconnected. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled in the way that suggested she was working hard not to say exactly what she thought. "And what do you think about that?" "I think I don't have much choice in the matter." The words came out more bitter than I'd intended, but I was beyond caring about maintaining a facade of acceptance. "There's always a choice, Lena. It might not be an easy choice, but there's always a choice." Eleanor's voice had shifted into the tone she used when she was absolutely serious about something. "Do you want company for whatever conversation you're planning to have with Michael about this?" The offer was tempting, but I knew that having Eleanor present would only make Michael more defensive and determined to prove that his plan was reasonable. Besides, this was my battle to fight, even if I wasn't sure yet how to win it. "Thank you, but I think I need to handle this myself." "Well, you know where I am if you change your mind. And Lena? Don't let anyone convince you that wanting to stay in your own home makes you stubborn or unreasonable. Some things are worth fighting for." After she hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand, thinking about what she'd said. Some things are worth fighting for. The question was whether I still had any fight left in me, and if I did, whether I was brave enough to use it against my own son. I looked at the clock and realized I had less than 2 hours before my orientation tour at Sunset Manor. 2 hours to decide whether I was going to walk through those doors as a defeated old woman grateful for whatever scraps of dignity they were willing to offer me, or as someone who still believed her own life belonged to her. The choice, as Eleanor had pointed out, was mine to make. I just had to find the courage to make it. I walked upstairs to my bedroom and opened the closet where I kept my most important papers in a small fireproof safe David had insisted we buy years ago. Inside, along with our marriage certificate and his death certificate and my will, was a folder I hadn't opened in months, but that contained documents that could change everything about the conversation I was about to have. My hands were steady as I pulled out the folder and sat on the edge of my bed to review its contents. The papers inside told a story that Michael had never heard, a story about the woman I'd been before I became his mother and David's wife. They documented a journey that had begun more than 50 years ago with a small inheritance from my grandmother and a young woman's determination to build something meaningful with her life. The first document was a certificate of incorporation for Brooks Senior Care Services, dated 1972, listing me as the sole founder and president. What had started as a single small nursing home in a converted Victorian house had grown over the decades into something I'd never imagined possible. Brooks Senior Care Services now operated 47 facilities across 3 states, including the newest and most luxurious addition to our portfolio, a place called Sunset Manor. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. Michael was trying to force me into a facility that I not only owned but had personally designed to be everything I thought a senior living community should be. The folder contained financial statements that would have made Michael's eyes widen in disbelief. Brooks Senior Care Services generated more than $200 million in annual revenue, and as the sole owner of the company, I controlled assets worth well over $500 million. The modest lifestyle David and I had chosen to live was exactly that, a choice, not a necessity. We'd preferred quiet evenings at home to lavish vacations, and we'd found more satisfaction in building something meaningful than in displaying our wealth. I'd kept the business deliberately separate from our family life, partly because David had preferred his work as a high school history teacher to any involvement in corporate management, and partly because I'd wanted Michael to find his own path without feeling pressured to join a family business. The result was that my son had grown up with no idea that his mother was anything more than a retired nurse who'd made some smart investments over the years. The decision to keep my business life private had seemed wise at the time, but sitting on my bed with those documents in my hands, I realized it had also made me vulnerable in ways I'd never anticipated. Michael's perception of me as a helpless elderly woman living alone in a house she could no longer afford was so far from reality that it would have been funny if it weren't so insulting. He'd never bothered to ask about my finances or my plans for the future. He'd simply assumed that his 45-year-old judgment was superior to my 74 years of experience. The more I thought about the morning's ambush, the angrier I became. Not just angry about the assisted living plan, but about the fundamental disrespect it represented. Michael had made major decisions about my life without consulting me, arranged for strangers to invade my home to present me with a fait accompli, and expected me to be grateful for his intervention. The casual arrogance of it was breathtaking. I thought about Patricia Wells and her practiced smile, her professional sympathy for the confused old woman who needed help adjusting to reality. What would that smile look like when she discovered that the woman she was patronizing actually owned the facility she worked for? The thought was admittedly satisfying, but it also opened up possibilities I hadn't considered. This wasn't just about teaching Michael a lesson in respect, though he certainly needed one. This was about reclaiming control of my own narrative and my own future. If I was going to tour Sunset Manor this afternoon, it wouldn't be as a potential resident being evaluated for admission. It would be as the owner conducting an unannounced inspection of my property. I put the documents back in the folder and locked the safe, but I kept out one specific paper, a business card for my attorney, Margaret Chen, who had been handling my legal affairs for more than 20 years. Margaret was one of the few people who knew the full extent of my business holdings, and she was exactly the kind of sharp, no-nonsense advocate I was going to need for what I was planning. When I called her office, her assistant put me through immediately, recognizing my name and understanding that when I called, it was usually for something important. "Lena, how are you? It's been too long since we've talked." "I'm well, Margaret, but I have a situation that requires some immediate attention." I explained Michael's plan and the morning's confrontation, watching through my bedroom window as he stood in my backyard, having what appeared to be an animated phone conversation. "I need you to prepare some documents for me, and I need them by tomorrow morning." Margaret listened without interruption, asking only a few clarifying questions about timeline and specific details. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before she spoke. "Lena, Are you absolutely certain this is how you want to handle this? Once you reveal your ownership of Brooke Senior Care Services, there's no taking it back. Your family relationships could be permanently changed. I watched Michael gesture emphatically to whoever he was talking to, probably explaining to some business associate why he'd be distracted for the next few days, while he managed his mother's transition to assisted living. The conversation was clearly about me, but I wasn't included in it, just as I hadn't been included in any of the other decisions that had been made about my future. Margaret, my family relationships were changed the moment my son decided I was incompetent to manage my own life. I'm not trying to punish him, but I'm not going to let him bulldoze me either. Some things are worth fighting for, and my dignity is one of them. Then we'll make sure you have everything you need for that fight, she said with the fierce loyalty that had made her one of the most respected attorneys in the state. I'll have the documents ready by 9 tomorrow morning, and I'll make some calls to ensure that the appropriate people at Sunset Manor are available to meet with you. After we hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the morning's ambush began. A sense of control over my own destiny. I was no longer a victim of other people's plans for my life. I was a woman with resources and options, and the determination to use both. I spent the rest of the morning making careful preparations for the afternoon's tour. I selected my outfit with the same attention I'd once given to important business meetings, choosing clothes that projected quiet authority, rather than elderly fragility. A navy blue dress that fit perfectly, low heels that were comfortable but professional, and the pearl necklace David had given me for our 25th anniversary. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the helpless old woman Patricia and Jennifer expected to meet at 2 o'clock. I saw Lena Brooks, founder and CEO of one of the most successful senior care companies in the country, preparing for what might be the most important business meeting of her career. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. In a few hours, I would walk through the doors of a facility I had personally planned and financed, guided by employees who had no idea they were showing their boss around her own property. Michael would be there too, probably feeling proud of himself for solving the problem of his difficult mother with such efficiency and compassion. But the real revelation wouldn't come today. Today was just reconnaissance, a chance to see how my son and his chosen advocates behaved when they thought they held all the power. Tomorrow would be the day of reckoning, when everyone involved would learn exactly who Lena Brooks really was, and what she was capable of when pushed too far. I made myself a simple lunch, and ate it slowly, savoring not just the food but the knowledge that this might be one of the last meals I would eat in my kitchen, as a woman whose life was considered to be spiraling out of control. By this time tomorrow, everyone would understand that I had never lost control of anything. I had simply been choosing my battles more carefully than they realized. The phone rang again, and this time it was Michael, his voice carrying that false cheerfulness people use when they're trying to manage someone they consider unstable. Mom, I just wanted to check in and make sure you're feeling okay about this afternoon. I know it's a big change, but I really think you're going to love Sunset Manor once you see it. I'm looking forward to the tour, I said, which was absolutely true, though not for the reasons he imagined. That's great to hear. I'll meet you there at 2, and afterward maybe we can grab some coffee and talk about the practical details of the move. Patricia mentioned that they have some forms for you to fill out, and we should probably start making lists of what you want to take with you and what we'll need to sell with the house. Lists of what I wanted to take and what would be sold, as if my entire life could be divided into 2 categories, worth keeping and worth converting to cash. The casual brutality of it was staggering, but I kept my voice level and cooperative. That sounds very practical, Michael. I'm sure you've thought of everything. I've tried to. I know this isn't easy for you, but I really believe it's the right choice for everyone involved. You'll be safer, I'll have peace of mind, and the house will go to someone who can really take care of it properly. Everyone involved. Peace of mind. Someone who can take care of it properly. Each phrase was a small knife, cutting away at my sense of belonging in my own life. But tomorrow, Michael would learn what it felt like to have someone else make major decisions about his future without consulting him. The difference was that my decisions would be based on facts rather than assumptions, and power rather than good intentions. I'll see you at 2, I said, and hung up before he could launch into any more explanations of why dismantling my life was actually an act of love. I spent the last hour before leaving the house walking through each room one more time, not with the sadness of someone saying goodbye, but with the satisfaction of someone preparing to reclaim what belonged to her. This house would not be sold. These rooms would not be emptied and staged for strangers. My life would not be reduced to whatever could fit in a single room at an assisted living facility, no matter how luxurious that facility might be. As I gathered my purse and keys, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and smiled. Patricia Wells and Jennifer were about to give a tour to a woman they thought they understood completely. Michael was about to show off his solution to the problem of his aging mother. And I was about to remind everyone involved that assumptions, no matter how reasonable they seem, can be dangerously wrong. The drive to Sunset Manor took only 15 minutes, but it felt like traveling between two different versions of my life. Behind me was the woman Michael saw, elderly and increasingly helpless, grateful for whatever assistance her more capable son could provide. Ahead of me was the woman I actually was, successful and sharp, and fully capable of fighting her own battles. When I pulled into the parking lot of Sunset Manor, I took a moment to appreciate the irony of the situation from a professional perspective. The building was beautiful, exactly what I'd envisioned when I'd commissioned the architects 3 years ago. Red brick and white columns, surrounded by carefully landscaped gardens and walking paths that provided both beauty and accessibility for residents with mobility challenges. Every detail had been planned with dignity and comfort in mind, and I was genuinely proud of what we'd created. Patricia's car was already in the parking lot, along with Michael's BMW and another vehicle I didn't recognize. They were probably inside, making final preparations for the tour and discussing strategies for helping me adjust to what they considered an inevitable transition. The thought of their well-meaning conspiracy against my independence was almost amusing now that I understood exactly how much power I actually held in this situation. I walked through the front doors of Sunset Manor with my head high and my shoulders straight, every inch the successful businesswoman I'd been for more than 50 years. The lobby was exactly as I'd specified, elegant but welcoming, with comfortable seating areas and large windows that filled the space with natural light. Classical music played softly in the background, and the whole atmosphere was designed to feel more like a luxury hotel than an institutional facility. Patricia appeared almost immediately, her professional smile in place and her hand extended in greeting. "Mrs. Brooks, how wonderful to see you again. Are you ready for your tour?" "Absolutely," I replied, shaking her hand and looking directly into her eyes. "I'm very interested to see everything you have to offer." Michael emerged from what I recognized as the administrative office, accompanied by a woman in a business suit who was probably the facility director. His smile was relieved, probably because I appeared calm and cooperative rather than resistant and emotional. "Mom, you look great. This is Sandra Martinez, the director of Sunset Manor. Sandra, this is my mother, Lena Brooks." Sandra stepped forward with the warm professionalism I expected from someone in her position. "It's such a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Brooks. We're honored that you're considering Sunset Manor for your new home. I think you'll find that we offer all the services and amenities that make senior living both comfortable and fulfilling." New home. The phrase was carefully chosen, designed to make assisted living sound like a positive choice, rather than a surrender of independence. I smiled and nodded appropriately, playing the role of the uncertain elderly woman, while mentally noting every detail of how my facility was being presented to potential residents and their families. The tour began in the dining room, where Patricia enthusiastically described the meal service and social opportunities that centered around shared dining experiences. The room was beautiful, with round tables that encouraged conversation and large windows overlooking the gardens. I nodded and asked appropriate questions while privately noting that the fresh flowers on each table were exactly the touch I'd insisted on during the design phase. We moved through the common areas, the library, the fitness center, and the arts and crafts room, with Patricia maintaining her cheerful commentary about community life and the many ways residents could stay active and engaged. Michael walked beside me, pointing out features he thought I'd particularly enjoy, and maintaining the encouraging tone of someone helping a reluctant patient accept necessary medical treatment. "The art room is really impressive, Mom," he said as we stood in the bright, well-equipped space where several residents were working on various projects. "Remember how much you used to enjoy painting? You could take classes again." I used to enjoy painting, past tense, as if my interests and capabilities belonged to a previous version of myself that no longer existed. The casual dismissal of my current life was breathtaking in its completeness. But I smiled and agreed that the art room was very nice, while privately noting that the north-facing windows and professional-grade lighting were exactly what I'd specified to make the space perfect for serious artistic work. The tour continued through the residential wing, where Patricia showed us different room configurations and explained the various levels of care that were available as residents' needs changed over time. The rooms were spacious and well-appointed, with private bathrooms and sitting areas that were designed to feel more like home than like institutional housing. We encourage residents to bring their own furniture and personal items, Sandra explained as we stood in a model apartment. The goal is to create a space that feels familiar and comfortable, not generic or impersonal. Michael nodded approvingly. That's important. Mom has some beautiful antique pieces that belong to her grandmother. It would be nice if she could keep some of them. Some of them, not all of them. Because there wouldn't be room for everything I'd collected over a lifetime of creating a home. Just the pieces that could fit into a single room, carefully selected and arranged to provide the illusion of continuity with a life that was being systematically dismantled. As we walked through the facility, I found myself genuinely impressed with how well my vision had been executed. The staff was professional and caring, the residents appeared content and engaged, and every detail reflected the commitment to dignity and quality that had been my primary concern when developing the concept for Sunset Manor. If I had actually needed assisted living, this would have been exactly the kind of place I'd want to live. But I didn't need assisted living, and the people conducting this tour had never bothered to determine whether their assumptions about my capabilities were accurate. They'd seen an elderly woman living alone and concluded that she must need help, without considering the possibility that she might be choosing independence because she was fully capable of maintaining it. The tour concluded in Patricia's office, where she spread out brochures and contracts while explaining the financial arrangements and move-in procedures. Michael sat beside me, occasionally asking practical questions about meal plans and medical services, while I listened and nodded and mentally calculated exactly how much profit Sunset Manor would generate from my residency. The monthly fee includes all meals, housekeeping, basic medical monitoring, and access to all our recreational and social programs, Patricia explained, sliding a fee schedule across the desk. There are additional charges for some specialized services, but for most residents, the basic package covers everything they need. I looked at the numbers, which were substantial but fair for the level of service being provided. What Patricia didn't know was that these fees represented a tiny fraction of my monthly income from Brooks Senior Care Services, and that the profit margins built into the pricing structure were exactly what I'd approved during the business planning process. It seems reasonable, I said, which was true from both perspectives. As a potential resident, the fees were competitive with other high-quality facilities. As the owner, they represented exactly the kind of sustainable pricing that would ensure long-term financial stability for the business. Michael leaned forward, clearly pleased with my apparent acceptance of the financial arrangements. And the house sale should cover several years of residence, with enough left over for any additional needs that might come up. Several years. Once again, my son was calculating the remaining duration of my life like any other business expense. The casual cruelty of it was stunning, but I maintained my composed expression while Patricia organized the paperwork that would formalize my transformation from independent homeowner to assisted living resident. We do require a physical examination and a basic cognitive assessment before move-in, Sandra explained, her tone suggesting this was a routine formality rather than a judgment of my competence. It's really just to ensure that we can provide appropriate care and to establish baseline measurements for future reference. A cognitive assessment. The final insult in a day full of them. Not only had Michael decided I was no longer capable of living independently, but the facility was going to test me to confirm that diagnosis. The fact that I would undoubtedly pass any such assessment with flying colors was irrelevant. The assumption that I needed to prove my mental competence was degrading beyond words. That sounds very thorough, I said, because there was no point in objecting to procedures I had no intention of ever submitting to. Patricia handed me a folder containing all the paperwork and contact information, along with a welcome packet that included a calendar of activities and a resident handbook. Take your time looking through everything, and please don't hesitate to call if you have any questions. We want your transition to be as smooth as possible. As we walked back to the parking lot, Michael seemed genuinely pleased with how the tour had gone. His relief was almost palpable, probably because I hadn't created the scene he'd apparently been bracing himself for. Instead, I'd been polite, engaged, and seemingly receptive to the idea of making Sunset Manor my new home. "So what do you think, Mom? It's really nice, isn't it?" His voice carried the hopeful tone of someone who believed he'd successfully navigated a difficult family crisis with minimal drama. "It's very impressive," I replied, which was completely honest. "The attention to detail is remarkable. Someone clearly put a lot of thought into creating something special." Michael smiled, probably interpreting my comment as acceptance of his plan rather than professional appreciation for my own work. "I knew you'd see that it's not like the old nursing homes. This is more like a resort, where you just happen to live full-time. A resort where you just happen to live full-time." The comparison was more accurate than he realized, except that resort guests generally chose their destination and could leave whenever they wanted. But I didn't point out the flaws in his analogy. Instead, I thanked Patricia and Sandra for their time and promised to review all the paperwork carefully. "We'll be in touch very soon," Michael told them, shaking hands with the professional warmth of someone closing a successful business deal. "I think Monday's move-in date will work perfectly." Monday. 4 days from now. I managed to keep my expression neutral, but internally I marveled at the speed with which my life was being reorganized. By Monday, according to Michael's timeline, I would wake up in a room at Sunset Manor while strangers prepared my house for sale. The efficiency of it was breathtaking. During the drive home, I found myself thinking about the residents I'd observed during the tour. Most of them had seemed content, engaged in activities or conversations that suggested they'd found ways to create meaningful lives within the structure of assisted living. But I'd also noticed something in their eyes, a kind of resigned acceptance that reminded me of people who'd learned to make the best of circumstances they hadn't chosen. That resignation was exactly what Michael expected from me. He wanted me to accept his decision with grace, to be grateful for his intervention, and to settle into my new life with the minimum possible disruption to his own plans. The fact that I might have different ideas about my future wasn't something he'd seriously considered. When I arrived home, Eleanor was working in her front garden, and she looked up with the expression of someone who'd been waiting for news. I pulled into my driveway and walked over to the low fence that separated our properties. "How did it go?" she asked, brushing soil from her hands and giving me her full attention. "It's a beautiful facility," I said, which was true. Very well designed and professionally managed. Eleanor studied my face with the sharp perception that comes from 40 years of friendship. But I'm not ready to give up my independence just because Michael thinks it would be more convenient for everyone involved. She nodded slowly, as if I'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. "What are you going to do about it?" "I'm going to remind everyone involved that this is still my life to live." The words came out with more steel than I'd intended, but Eleanor smiled as if she approved of what she was hearing. "Good for you. And if you need any help with that reminder, you know where to find me." I thanked her and went inside, but instead of feeling exhausted by the day's emotional challenges, I felt energized by a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in months. Tomorrow would bring the first phase of reclaiming control over my own destiny, and I was eager to begin. That evening, I called Margaret Chen's office and left a detailed message about the day's events, including specific information about the timeline Michael had established and the assumptions that seemed to be driving his decisions. I also asked her to schedule a meeting with the senior management team at Brook Senior Care Services for the following afternoon. It was time to activate resources I'd kept in reserve for far too long. I spent the rest of the evening reviewing financial statements and corporate documents, reacquainting myself with details of a business empire I'd built over decades of careful planning and strategic growth. Brooks Senior Care Services wasn't just a successful company. It was a comprehensive network of facilities, services, and partnerships that had made me one of the most influential figures in the senior care industry. The irony of Michael's timing was particularly striking. Just 2 months earlier, I'd been featured on the cover of Senior Care Executive magazine as Visionary of the Year, recognized for innovations that had transformed how the industry approached dignity and independence for elderly residents. The article had praised my philosophy that assisted living should enhance rather than replace personal autonomy, and it had highlighted Sunset Manor as the crown jewel of facilities that embodied this approach. Michael had never seen that article, of course, because he'd never bothered to learn about my professional life. In his mind, I was simply his aging mother, who'd once worked as a nurse and had been fortunate enough to make some wise investments. The possibility that I might be actively engaged in work that was both meaningful and lucrative had never occurred to him. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the conversation we would have after tomorrow's revelations. Michael would be shocked, probably angry, and almost certainly defensive about his assumptions and actions. But he would also be forced to acknowledge that the woman he'd been treating as incompetent was actually far more capable than he'd ever imagined. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect weather for what I privately thought of as my declaration of independence. I dressed with the same care I'd taken for important business meetings throughout my career, choosing a charcoal gray suit that projected authority without appearing intimidating. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a successful executive who'd built something remarkable and wasn't about to let anyone take it away from her. Margaret Chen arrived at my house at precisely 9 o'clock, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the expression of someone prepared for battle. She'd been my attorney for more than 20 years, and she understood both my business philosophy and my personal values well enough to know that this wasn't just about corporate power plays. This was about fundamental respect and human dignity. "Are you absolutely certain you want to do this, Lena?" she asked as we sat in my living room reviewing the documents she'd prepared. Once Michael learns about Brooks Senior Care Services, everything changes. Your relationship with him, his understanding of who you are, his assumptions about his own inheritance. You can't take any of it back. I considered her question seriously because she was right about the irreversible nature of what I was planning. But then I thought about the casual way Michael had arranged to have me institutionalized, the assumption that my own preferences were irrelevant to decisions about my future, and the fundamental disrespect that had made such treatment seem reasonable to him. "Margaret, my relationship with Michael has already changed. He's made it clear that he sees me as a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be respected. I'd rather have an honest relationship based on the truth than a dishonest one, based on his misconceptions about my capabilities." She nodded and opened her briefcase, spreading out the documents that would formalize the most dramatic revelation of my son's life. "Then let's make sure you have everything you need to reclaim control of this situation." The first document was a comprehensive financial statement showing my ownership of Brooks Senior Care Services and the current value of my holdings. The numbers were impressive even to me, representing decades of reinvested profits and strategic expansion that had built a business worth more than $500 million. The second document was a letter of instruction to the management team at Sunset Manor, informing them that I would be conducting an unannounced inspection of the facility, and that they should be prepared to discuss any operational issues or concerns I might identify. The letter was written on Brooks Senior Care Services letterhead and signed with my full corporate title, Lena Brooks, Founder and Chief Executive Officer. The third document was perhaps the most important, a legal directive removing Michael from any authority over my medical or financial decisions, and explicitly stating that any arrangements made without my direct consent were null and void. This would ensure that his deposit at Sunset Manor and his plans to sell my house had no legal standing whatsoever. "The management team at Sunset Manor has been notified that you'll be arriving at 2 o'clock this afternoon," Margaret explained. They're understandably surprised, since they had no idea that their new resident was actually their owner, but they're scrambling to prepare for what they assume will be a routine corporate inspection. I smiled at the thought of Patricia Wells and Sandra Martinez trying to make sense of this unexpected development. They'd spent yesterday afternoon showing me around a facility they thought I might want to live in, and today they would discover that I was the person who paid their salaries and determined their budgets. What about Michael? I asked. How do you think we should handle his reaction to all this? Margaret's expression became thoughtful. That depends on what outcome you're hoping for, Lena. Do you want to humiliate him publicly, or do you want to educate him privately? Do you want to punish him for his assumptions, or do you want to give him a chance to understand who you really are? It was a fair question, and one I'd been wrestling with since yesterday's tour. My anger at Michael's high-handed treatment was justified, but I also remembered the little boy who used to fall asleep in my lap while I read him stories. Somewhere underneath his arrogant assumptions about my incompetence was the son I'd raised to be thoughtful and respectful, even if he seemed to have forgotten those lessons when it came to dealing with his aging mother. I want him to understand that actions have consequences, I said finally. And I want him to learn that making assumptions about other people, especially people you claim to love, can be dangerous. But I don't want to destroy him. I want to educate him. Margaret nodded approvingly. Then I suggest we invite him to join us at Sunset Manor this afternoon. Let him witness your inspection as the facility owner, and then have a private conversation afterward about what this means for your relationship going forward. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Michael would see me transformed, from helpless elderly woman to powerful business executive in the space of a single afternoon. He would understand that every assumption he'd made about my life was not just wrong, but dramatically wrong. And he would be forced to confront the implications of his own actions in the clear light of complete honesty. I called Michael at his office, using my most cooperative and grandmotherly tone. "Hello, dear. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all, Mom. How are you feeling today? I know yesterday was probably overwhelming, but I hope you've had time to think about how nice Sunset Manor really is." The condescending warmth in his voice was almost remarkable. He genuinely believed that I needed time to adjust my expectations to the reality of assisted living, and that his patience and encouragement would help me accept what he considered an inevitable transition. "Actually, I have been thinking about it quite a lot," I said. "I was wondering if you might be free this afternoon around 2 o'clock. I'd like to go back to Sunset Manor and take another look at some things I might have missed yesterday." Michael's pleasure was audible in his voice. "That's wonderful, Mom. I think a second visit is a great idea. Sometimes it takes a while to really appreciate all the advantages of a place like that. Would you be able to meet me there? I'd value your perspective on some of the details." "Of course. I'll rearrange my schedule. This is much more important than anything else I had planned." The irony of his statement was almost overwhelming, but I managed to keep my voice steady and appreciative. "Thank you, Michael. I'll see you at 2 o'clock. After I hung up, Margaret looked at me with something that might have been admiration. "You're remarkably calm for someone who's about to turn her son's world upside down." "I've had a long time to prepare for this conversation, even if I didn't realize it until yesterday," I replied. "And honestly, I'm looking forward to seeing Michael learn something about making assumptions." We spent the rest of the morning reviewing operational reports from Sunset Manor and the other facilities in the Brooks Senior Care Services network. As the owner of the company, I needed to be prepared for detailed discussions about occupancy rates, staffing levels, quality metrics, and financial performance. This wouldn't just be a dramatic revelation. It would be a legitimate business inspection conducted by someone who understood every aspect of the senior care industry. The reports were impressive, confirming that Sunset Manor was performing at the highest levels across all measures of resident satisfaction and operational efficiency. The facility I'd toured yesterday wasn't just beautiful. It was also professionally managed and financially successful. If I had actually needed assisted living, I would have been genuinely proud to live there. But I didn't need assisted living, and the staff at Sunset Manor was about to learn that their newest potential resident was actually their most important stakeholder. The transformation would be as educational for them as it would be for Michael. At 1:30, Margaret and I drove to Sunset Manor in her car, leaving my modest sedan at home in favor of her luxury BMW. Image mattered in business, and I wanted to arrive looking like the successful executive I actually was, rather than the confused elderly woman everyone expected to see. The facility looked exactly the same as it had yesterday, but my perspective was entirely different. Instead of seeing a place where I might be forced to live, I saw a business I had created and continued to own. Every architectural detail, every landscaping choice, Every operational decision reflected my vision of what senior care should look like when it was done with genuine respect for the people it served. We parked near the main entrance, and I took a moment to compose myself for what would certainly be one of the most interesting business meetings of my career. In a few minutes, everyone involved would learn that reality could be very different from assumptions, and that power structures could shift in ways that no one had anticipated. Margaret gathered her briefcase and looked at me with the expression of someone about to witness something remarkable. "Are you ready for this, Lena?" "I've been ready for this my entire life," I replied. "I just didn't know it until yesterday." We walked through the front doors of Sunset Manor with the confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of achieving. The lobby looked the same as it had during yesterday's tour, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Instead of being a potential resident being evaluated for admission, I was the owner conducting an inspection of my property. Sandra Martinez appeared almost immediately, but her demeanor was completely transformed from yesterday's warm professionalism. She looked nervous, slightly confused, and clearly uncertain about how to handle this unexpected development. Behind her stood Patricia Wells, whose practiced smile was noticeably strained. "Mrs. Brooks," Sandra said, her voice carefully controlled. "We received the letter from your attorney this morning. I have to admit, we were quite surprised to learn about your connection to Brooks Senior Care Services." I smiled with the gracious authority I'd perfected during decades of corporate leadership. "I imagine you were. I don't generally announce my business relationships during personal visits, but circumstances have made it necessary to clarify a few things." Patricia stepped forward, and I could see her trying to reconcile yesterday's potential resident with today's corporate owner. "Mrs. Brooks, if we had known who you were yesterday, we would have conducted the tour very differently. We hope you weren't testing us or evaluating our performance without our knowledge." "Actually, that's exactly what I was doing," I replied calmly, though not intentionally. "I was genuinely interested in seeing how you present the facility to families who are considering residency for their elderly relatives. Your professionalism was impressive, and I was pleased to see that the reality matches the standards I established when we designed this facility." The relief on both women's faces was visible, but it was mixed with confusion about what was happening and why. They clearly understood that their jobs might depend on how they handled this unusual situation, but they had no context for understanding what had prompted my surprise inspection. "Perhaps we could start over," Sandra suggested. "Would you like us to show you the facility from an operational perspective rather than a residency perspective?" "That won't be necessary," I said. "I'm quite familiar with the operational details. What I'd like to do is have a brief conversation about yesterday's tour and some concerns that have arisen since then." I gestured toward the administrative office, and Sandra led us into the same room where Patricia had spread out contracts and fee schedules less than 24 hours earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. This was where Michael had expected me to sign away my independence, and it was where I would instead reclaim control over my own life. We had barely settled into our chairs when Michael arrived, looking pleased with himself and eager to continue the process of transitioning his mother into assisted living. He walked into the office with the confident stride of someone who believed he was managing a difficult situation successfully. "Mom, I'm so glad you decided to come back for another look," he said, taking the chair beside me. "I think once you spend a little more time here, you'll realize how perfect this place is for this stage of your life." This stage of your life. The phrase was particularly galling coming from someone who had never bothered to learn what stage of life I was actually in. But I smiled and nodded, letting him settle into his assumptions before I began dismantling them. Sandra cleared her throat and looked at Michael with an expression that suggested she wasn't sure how to proceed. "Mr. Brooks, there's been an interesting development since yesterday's tour. We've learned some additional information about your mother that puts her residency application in a rather different context." Michael looked puzzled, but not concerned. "What kind of additional information?" Margaret opened her briefcase and placed the financial statement on the desk where everyone could see it. The numbers were clear and unmistakable. Lena Brooks, net worth exceeding $500 million, primary source of wealth being Brooks Senior Care Services, a company she had founded and continued to own. Michael stared at the document for a long moment, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something that might have been recognition. "I don't understand. What is Brooks Senior Care Services?" And what does it have to do with Mom? I leaned forward slightly, meeting his eyes directly. Brooks Senior Care Services is the company I founded in 1972, Michael. It operates 47 senior living facilities across 3 states, including Sunset Manor. I'm not a potential resident here. I'm the owner. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Michael's face went through a series of expressions as he processed information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his mother's life. Patricia and Sandra looked like people who were watching a family drama unfold in their office and weren't sure whether they should stay or leave. That's impossible, Michael said finally. You're a retired nurse. You've never mentioned owning a business, let alone a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I'm a registered nurse who built a business empire while raising you and caring for your father, I corrected gently. I chose to keep my professional life separate from our family life, partly because your father preferred his teaching career to corporate involvement, and partly because I wanted you to find your own path without feeling pressured to join a family business. Michael looked at the financial statement again, as if staring at it might change the numbers, or reveal some mistake that would restore his understanding of reality. But you live so modestly. You drive an old car, you shop at discount stores, you worry about utility bills. I live modestly because I choose to, not because I have to. And I've never worried about utility bills. The one you mentioned was a simple oversight that I corrected the same day, not a sign of financial distress or cognitive decline. The implications of what I was saying began to register on Michael's face. If I wasn't financially vulnerable, if I wasn't struggling to maintain my independence, if I was actually a successful business owner rather than a helpless elderly woman, then every assumption that had justified his intervention was wrong. You own this place? He asked, gesturing around the office. I own this place, I confirmed. I designed it, financed it, and continue to oversee its operations. The tour Patricia gave us yesterday was actually quite good, though I would have preferred to experience it as a potential resident rather than as the owner conducting an unannounced inspection. Patricia made a small sound that might have been a gasp. You were evaluating our performance without telling us? I was trying to understand why my son thought this facility would be appropriate for someone like me, I said. Now I understand that he made that decision based on assumptions about my capabilities and circumstances that were completely inaccurate. Michael's face had gone pale, and he was looking at me as if seeing a stranger. Why didn't you tell me? All these years, why didn't you tell me you owned a business empire? The hurt in his voice was genuine, and for a moment I felt a stab of regret for the secrecy that had made this confrontation necessary. But then I remembered the casual way he'd arranged to have me institutionalized, the assumption that my preferences were irrelevant to decisions about my future, and the fundamental disrespect that had made such treatment seem reasonable to him. Because I wanted you to see me as your mother, not as a wealthy woman whose approval might advance your career, I said. And because I believed that successful parenting meant raising a son who would treat people with respect, regardless of their apparent status or resources. The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable, and Michael flinched as if I'd slapped him. I was trying to help you. I was worried about your safety and your ability to manage such a large house alone. Were you worried, Michael? Or were you worried about the inconvenience of having an aging mother who might need assistance you weren't prepared to provide? I kept my voice calm, but there was steel underneath the surface. Because arranging to have someone institutionalized without their consent isn't help. It's control. Sandra and Patricia were looking increasingly uncomfortable with this family confrontation taking place in their office, but Margaret gestured for them to remain seated. As my attorney, she understood that witnesses to this conversation might be important if there were any legal challenges to the decisions I was making. I never meant to control you, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. I thought you needed help making decisions about your future. I don't need help making decisions, Michael. I need respect for the decisions I make. I picked up the financial statement and held it so he could see the numbers clearly. This document represents 50 years of making excellent decisions about complex business challenges. Do you really think someone capable of building and managing this kind of enterprise is incompetent to decide where she wants to live? The question hung in the air between us, highlighting the fundamental contradiction in his assumptions. Michael had been treating me as someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted, while simultaneously benefiting from decisions I'd made that had created wealth beyond his imagination. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I thought you were struggling financially. I thought the house was becoming too much for you to handle." "You thought wrong because you never asked," I replied. "You made assumptions based on stereotypes about elderly women, and you acted on those assumptions without bothering to verify whether they were accurate." Margaret leaned forward and placed another document on the desk. "Mr. Brooks, this is a legal directive removing you from any authority over your mother's medical or financial decisions. It also nullifies any arrangements you've made on her behalf without her explicit consent, including the deposit you placed on her residency here." Michael stared at the document as if it were a foreign language. "You're cutting me out of your life?" "I'm establishing boundaries that should have been obvious without legal documentation," I said. "My life belongs to me, Michael. My decisions are mine to make. If you want to be part of my life, it will be as my son, not as my guardian or manager." The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, but I waited for Michael to process what he was hearing. This wasn't just about assisted living or house sales or financial arrangements. This was about fundamental respect and the right to determine the course of one's own life. Finally, Michael looked up from the documents and met my eyes. "What happens now?" "Now you learn to see me as I actually am instead of as you assumed I was," I said. "And I decide whether your behavior over the past few days represents a temporary lapse in judgment or a permanent change in your character." Sandra cleared her throat tentatively. "Mrs. Brooks, what about your residency application? Should we process the cancellation paperwork?" "There was never a legitimate residency application," Margaret answered before I could respond. "Mr. Brooks made arrangements without his mother's consent, using assumptions about her competence that have been proven false. Any agreements reached under those circumstances are invalid." Patricia looked relieved, probably because handling the cancellation of a residency for the facility owner would have been an unprecedented administrative challenge. "We'll process the refund of Mr. Brooks' deposit immediately." "That won't be necessary," I said. "Consider it a donation to your employee training fund. Use it to educate your staff about the importance of ensuring that potential residents are making informed decisions rather than being pressured by well-meaning family members." The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. I was using my son's deposit on my unwanted residency to fund training that would prevent other families from making the same mistakes he had made. The educational value alone was worth far more than the money involved. Michael had been quiet during this exchange, but now he looked at me with an expression that combined hurt, embarrassment, and something that might have been admiration. "You planned all of this, didn't you? The tour yesterday, the revelation today, the legal documents. You orchestrated this entire confrontation. I responded to your actions, Michael. You planned to institutionalize me without my consent. I planned to educate you about the consequences of making assumptions about people you claim to love." He nodded slowly, as if finally understanding the scope of his miscalculation. "What can I do to fix this?" The question was encouraging because it suggested he understood that something needed to be fixed. But it also revealed that he still expected me to provide him with a roadmap for rebuilding our relationship, as if I were responsible for managing his emotional growth as well as my own autonomy. "You can start by acknowledging that you treated me with fundamental disrespect," I said. "You can admit that your assumptions about my capabilities were not just wrong but insulting. And you can commit to approaching our relationship as equals, rather than as a competent adult managing an incompetent elderly woman." Michael was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with the implications of what I was asking. Admitting that he had been wrong about something so fundamental would require him to question other assumptions he'd made about aging, independence, and family relationships. "I was wrong," he said finally. "I was completely, embarrassingly wrong about who you are and what you're capable of. I treated you like a problem to be solved, instead of a person to be respected, and I'm ashamed of that." The acknowledgement was more complete than I'd expected, and I felt some of the anger I'd been carrying begin to dissipate. This was the son I remembered, the one who could admit mistakes and learn from them. "Thank you," I said simply. "That's a beginning." Margaret began gathering the documents from the desk, signaling that the official business portion of our meeting was concluded. Sandra and Patricia looked eager to escape what had clearly been one of the most unusual facility tours in their professional experience. "Mrs. Brooks," Sandra said, "would you like to schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss any operational concerns you might have identified during yesterday's tour?" I smiled at her diplomacy in treating my surprise inspection as a routine business matter. Actually, I was quite impressed with what I observed. The facility is operating exactly as I envisioned when we designed it, and your staff's professionalism was exemplary, even under these unusual circumstances. Patricia looked relieved. "We're honored to have Sunset Manor represent the Brooks Senior Care Services standards of excellence." As we prepared to leave, Michael stood and looked around the office, where his assumptions about my life had been systematically dismantled. "Mom, would you be willing to have dinner with me this week? I think we have a lot to talk about." "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it. "But understand that we'll be talking as equals. No more management decisions about my life, no more assumptions about my capabilities, and no more discussions about what's best for me without including me in those discussions." He nodded earnestly. "I understand. And Mom? I really am sorry. Not just about being wrong, but about the way I went about all of this. You deserved so much better from me." As we walked out of Sunset Manor, I felt a satisfaction that went deeper than vindication or revenge. I had reclaimed not just control over my living situation, but respect for my judgment and acknowledgement of my capabilities. The confrontation had been necessary, but the resolution had been healing. Margaret and I drove back to my house in comfortable silence, both of us processing what had just occurred. When she pulled into my driveway, she turned to me with an expression of professional admiration mixed with personal affection. "That was masterfully handled, Lena. You achieved everything you wanted without destroying the relationship permanently. Time will tell whether the relationship can be rebuilt," I said. "But at least now it will be based on honesty rather than misconceptions." As I walked back into my house, I looked around with fresh appreciation for what I had almost lost. These rooms wouldn't be emptied and staged for sale. My life wouldn't be reduced to whatever could fit in an assisted living apartment. My autonomy wouldn't be sacrificed to other people's assumptions about what elderly women needed or deserved. I had faced the challenge to my independence and emerged victorious, not through conflict but through truth. The revelation of my business success had been dramatic, but the real victory was simpler. I had insisted on being seen as I actually was, rather than as others assumed I should be. That evening, I called Eleanor to share the day's events. Her laughter was warm and delighted when I described Michael's reaction to learning that his helpless elderly mother was actually a business mogul who owned the facility he'd tried to force her into. "I wish I could have seen his face," she said. "That boy needed to learn that lesson, and I'm proud of you for teaching it to him." "I hope he learned it," I replied. "But even if he didn't, I learned something important about my own strength. I'm not ready to surrender my independence to anyone for any reason." "You never should have had to prove that," Eleanor said. "But I'm glad you proved it so thoroughly." As I prepared for bed, I thought about the conversation I would have with Michael over dinner later in the week. There would be questions about my business, about my decision to keep it secret, about what this revelation meant for our future relationship. But those were conversations between equals, not between a competent adult and someone he considered incompetent. The transformation was complete. I was no longer Michael's aging mother who needed management and protection. I was Lena Brooks, successful businesswoman, capable decision-maker, and formidable opponent when pushed too far. The distinction mattered more than I had realized, and I was grateful to have insisted on it before it was too late. Tomorrow I would return to my normal life, secure in the knowledge that it belonged entirely to me. The house would remain my home, my independence would remain intact, and my dignity would remain uncompromised. Some battles are worth fighting, and this had been one of them. 3 days after the confrontation at Sunset Manor, I was sitting in my kitchen reviewing quarterly reports from our facilities when the phone rang. The caller ID showed Michael's number, and I felt a familiar mixture of hope and wariness as I answered. "Hello, Michael." "Mom, I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." His voice carried a humility I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, apologizing for some minor transgression. "I've been thinking about everything that happened, and I realize there's so much I don't know about your life. Would you be willing to tell me about your business? I mean, really tell me, not just the basic facts." The request was encouraging because it suggested genuine curiosity rather than the perfunctory interest he might display to smooth over our recent conflict. "I'd be happy to share that with you, Michael. But it's a long story, and it might change how you think about some things." "I think my assumptions about a lot of things need changing," he said quietly. "Could we have that dinner we talked about? Maybe tomorrow night? I'll cook, and you can tell me how a nurse from Ohio ended up owning a senior care empire." The offer to cook was significant, a gesture of effort that went beyond simply choosing a restaurant. "I'd like that very much. Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself, and maybe some patience for all the questions I'm probably going to ask." After we hung up, I found myself looking forward to the conversation with an anticipation I hadn't expected. For decades, I'd kept my professional achievements separate from my family relationships, believing that this separation protected both spheres from contamination. But the recent crisis had shown me that secrecy, even well-intentioned secrecy, could create vulnerabilities I'd never anticipated. I spent the rest of the day organizing documents and photographs that would help Michael understand not just what I'd built, but why I'd built it, and how it had evolved over 5 decades. The story of Brooks Senior Care Services wasn't just a business history. It was the story of how a young woman's vision of dignified aging had transformed into a multi-state network of facilities that had changed thousands of lives. The next evening, I drove to Michael's house with a leather portfolio containing the materials I'd selected to illustrate my professional journey. His home was a testament to his success as a commercial architect. All clean lines and expensive materials arranged with the precision of someone who understood how spaces could influence emotions. But tonight, the usually immaculate kitchen showed signs of genuine effort, with pots on the stove and ingredients scattered across the granite countertops. "I'm making your grandmother's pot roast," he said, wiping his hands on a dish towel as he kissed my cheek. "I figured, if I was going to ask you to share family history, I should probably make family food." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched me more than I'd expected. My mother's pot roast recipe was something I'd taught him years ago, back when he'd shown interest in cooking before his career consumed all his attention. The fact that he'd remembered it, and chosen it for tonight, suggested that he understood this conversation was about more than business facts. "It smells exactly right," I said, settling into the chair he'd pulled out for me at his dining table. "Your grandmother would be proud." As we ate, I began the story I'd never told him, starting with the inheritance from my grandmother that had provided my initial capital, and the nursing experience that had shown me how poorly most elderly people were treated in institutional settings. I explained how my first facility had been driven by idealism rather than business acumen, and how the early failures had taught me that good intentions weren't enough to create sustainable change. Michael listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly absorbing information that recontextualized everything he thought he knew about my life during his childhood. When I described working 16-hour days to keep my first facility solvent while simultaneously raising him as a single mother after his father's death, his expression grew increasingly thoughtful. "I remember you being tired a lot when I was little," he said. "I thought it was because of your nursing shifts, but you were actually building a business empire while taking care of me." "I was doing what needed to be done," I replied. "The business was important, but you were more important. I never wanted you to feel like you were competing with my work for my attention. But I never understood what you were sacrificing to maintain that balance," he said. "I had no idea you were dealing with employee issues and financial crises and expansion decisions while helping me with homework and driving me to soccer practice." I showed him photographs from those early years, images of our first facility being renovated, of staff training sessions I'd conducted, of ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new locations. In many of the pictures, I looked exhausted but determined, a young woman carrying responsibilities that would have overwhelmed many people with more business experience. "This one was taken the day we opened our third facility," I said, pointing to a photograph of myself in a navy blue suit, standing beside a sign that read, "Brooks Senior Care Services, Dignity in Every Day." You were 8 years old and you had the flu. I'd been up all night with you, then drove 2 hours for the opening ceremony, then came home to make you soup. Michael studied the photograph with an expression I couldn't quite read. You look so young, but so serious, like you understood exactly what you were trying to accomplish. I did understand, even if I didn't always know how to accomplish it, I said. I'd seen too many elderly people treated as problems to be managed rather than individuals to be respected. Every facility we opened was an opportunity to prove that senior care could be different. As the evening progressed, I walked him through the major milestones of the company's growth, from our expansion into multiple states to our development of innovative care models that had been adopted throughout the industry. I showed him awards we'd received, articles written about our approach, and letters from families whose lives had been touched by our facilities. This is from the daughter of one of our first residents, I said, handing him a handwritten note dated 15 years earlier. Her mother had dementia, and most facilities wouldn't accept her because her behavior was considered too challenging. We developed specialized programming that allowed her to live with dignity for 3 more years. Michael read the letter slowly, and I could see him processing not just the words but their implications. This wasn't just about business success. It was about real people whose lives had been measurably improved by decisions I'd made and policies I'd implemented. Mom, this is incredible, he said, looking up from the letter. You've helped thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands. How did you keep this secret for so long? It wasn't exactly a secret, I said carefully. It was a boundary. I wanted our family relationships to be based on love and respect, not on what my business success might do for your career or social status. The comment was pointed but not accusatory, and Michael had the grace to recognize the implication. You were protecting me from becoming someone who might use you for personal advantage. I was protecting all of us from relationships that were contaminated by financial considerations, I corrected. But I was also protecting myself from people who might see me as an opportunity rather than as a person. Michael set down the letter and looked at me with an expression that combined admiration, regret, and something that might have been awe. I had no idea who you really were. All these years, I thought I was the successful one in the family, the one who'd made something of himself professionally. But you've accomplished more than I ever dreamed of accomplishing. Success isn't a competition, Michael, I said gently. Your architectural work is beautiful and meaningful. You've created spaces that enhance people's lives, and that matters. But success also isn't an excuse for dismissing other people's capabilities or making decisions for them without their consent. The rebuke was mild, but it brought us back to the conflict that had precipitated this conversation. Michael's face showed that he understood the connection between his assumptions about my professional limitations and his willingness to override my personal choices. When I saw you organizing pills and worrying about utility bills, I thought I was seeing an elderly woman struggling to manage basic tasks, he said. I never considered that you might be choosing to handle routine matters yourself rather than delegating them to staff. That's exactly what I was doing, I confirmed. I've always managed my own household, not because I have to, but because I want to. Independence isn't about capability, it's about choice. I showed him financial statements that illustrated the scope of Brooks Senior Care Services' current operations, pointing out facilities he might recognize, and explaining the corporate structure that had allowed us to grow while maintaining quality standards. The numbers were impressive, but more importantly, they demonstrated the sustained success that comes from principled leadership and strategic thinking. Sunset Manor was our most ambitious project, I explained, showing him architectural plans and development budgets. We wanted to create a facility that would set new standards for luxury senior living while maintaining the person-centered care philosophy that had always defined our approach. Michael studied the plans with professional interest, recognizing design elements and construction details that spoke to his own expertise. This is remarkable work, the attention to detail, the integration of medical functionality with residential comfort. Who was the architect? Robertson and Associates, I said. They're based in Chicago, and they specialize in senior living design. I worked with them for almost 2 years to get the concept exactly right. I know their work, Michael said, his voice carrying a note of professional respect. They're considered the best in the field. It must have cost a fortune to retain them for a project this complex. It did, I agreed, but it was worth every dollar. Sunset Manor has a waiting list of more than 200 people, and our resident satisfaction scores are the highest in the industry. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of us. Michael had tried to force me into a facility that represented the pinnacle of my professional achievement, a place I'd designed to embody everything I believed about dignified aging. His assumption that I needed institutional care had led him to choose the institution I'd created to provide exactly the kind of care I thought elderly people deserved. "You must have been so angry when I brought you there," he said quietly. "Not just because I was trying to force you into assisted living, but because I was trying to force you into your own facility without knowing who you were." I was angry, I admitted, but I was also fascinated to see how my vision had been implemented. The tour Patricia gave us was actually quite educational from a quality assurance perspective. Michael laughed, the first genuinely relaxed sound he'd made all evening. "You were conducting a business inspection while I thought you were being introduced to your new home. No wonder you seemed so calm about everything." "I was calm because I knew the situation was temporary," I said. "I've learned that most problems can be solved if you have adequate resources and the patience to use them strategically." As we moved to his living room for coffee, Michael's questions became more personal, focusing on how I'd managed to balance the demands of growing a business with the responsibilities of single motherhood. I explained the support systems I'd developed, the childcare arrangements that had allowed me to travel for business, and the careful scheduling that had ensured he never felt neglected despite my professional obligations. "You made it look effortless," he said. "I never felt like your work was more important to you than I was." "It wasn't more important," I said simply, "but it was important, and it provided the financial security that allowed me to focus on being the kind of mother I wanted to be." "Is that why you never remarried? Because you were too busy building the business?" The question was more personal than anything he'd asked so far, and I considered my response carefully. "I chose not to remarry because I'd found a way to create the life I wanted without compromising my independence or my priorities. Your father was a wonderful man, but he died young, and I discovered that I was capable of managing both business and family responsibilities without a partner." "Weren't you lonely?" "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I was also fulfilled in ways that many people never experience. Building something meaningful from nothing, creating jobs for hundreds of people, improving the lives of thousands of families. That kind of professional satisfaction sustained me through the lonely moments." Michael was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions he was still formulating. When he finally looked up, his expression was serious and slightly vulnerable. "I feel like I've been living my entire adult life based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who you are," he said. "I thought I was the ambitious one, the successful one, the one who'd exceeded his parents' achievements. But you've been quietly operating at a level one can't even imagine reaching." "Michael, this isn't about comparison or competition," I said firmly. "Your achievements are real and meaningful, but they don't give you the right to make decisions for other people, especially people whose capabilities you've underestimated." "I know that now," he said. "But I'm struggling with how to rebuild our relationship when I've been so wrong about something so fundamental." The vulnerability in his voice was genuine, and I felt my remaining anger begin to dissolve. This was the conversation I'd been hoping for, the acknowledgement that our relationship needed to be reconstructed on a foundation of mutual respect rather than assumed dependency. "You rebuild it by starting with honesty," I said. "You acknowledge what you got wrong, you commit to approaching me as an equal, and you accept that my decisions about my life are mine to make, even if you disagree with them. Even if those decisions seem dangerous or unwise to me?" "Especially then," I said, "because the alternative is what just happened. You decided I was incompetent based on limited information and your own assumptions, and you acted on that decision without consulting me. That's not protection, that's control." Michael nodded slowly, and I could see him processing the implications of what I was saying. "It's going to be hard for me to watch you age without trying to manage the process." "Then you'll need to learn new ways of expressing your concern," I replied. "Ask questions instead of making assumptions. Offer help instead of imposing solutions. Respect my choices even when they make you uncomfortable. What if you actually do need help someday? What if there comes a time when you can't live independently? The question was fair, and I appreciated that he was asking it directly, rather than simply making assumptions about my future needs. Then I'll make decisions about what kind of help I want and where I want to receive it. But those will be my decisions, made with full information about my options and resources. Including the possibility of actually living at one of your own facilities? I smiled at the thought. Including that possibility. Though if I ever do need assisted living, I'll choose the facility and the level of care based on my actual needs, rather than someone else's assumptions about what's appropriate for a woman my age. As the evening wound down, Michael walked me to my car, carrying the portfolio of documents I'd shared with him. The weight of it seemed to represent more than just papers. It was the accumulated evidence of a life he'd never known I'd lived. "Thank you for trusting me with all of this," he said as I settled into the driver's seat. "I know I haven't earned the right to know about your business, especially after what I tried to do." "You earned the right by being my son," I said. "But you kept the right by being willing to listen and learn from your mistakes." As I drove home, I reflected on the evening's conversation and what it might mean for our future relationship. Michael's willingness to acknowledge his errors and his genuine interest in understanding my professional life were encouraging signs that we might be able to rebuild on a stronger foundation. But I also recognized that changing fundamental assumptions about aging and independence would be an ongoing process, not a single conversation. Michael would need time to adjust his expectations and develop new patterns of interaction based on respect rather than concern. The next morning, I received a call from Sandra Martinez at Sunset Manor, asking if I had time to discuss some operational matters that had come to her attention during a recent staff meeting. The request was routine, the kind of management consultation that occurred regularly throughout our network of facilities. "Of course," I said. "Would you prefer to meet at the facility, or would you like to come to my office?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Brooks, I have to admit, I'm not sure where your office is located. After the other day's revelation, I realized I don't know anything about how you manage your business operations." The admission was both embarrassing and understandable. I've been so committed to maintaining separation between my personal and professional lives that even my own employees didn't know basic facts about my corporate structure. "I work primarily from home," I explained. "I have an office suite downtown for formal meetings, but most of my management activities are conducted remotely. Would you like to visit my home office this afternoon?" "That would be wonderful," Sandra said. "And Mrs. Brooks? I want to apologize again for not recognizing you during your son's visit. It must have been uncomfortable to be treated as a potential resident when you were actually evaluating our performance." "Actually, it was quite educational," I said. "I learned that our admission process is thorough and respectful, which is exactly what I hoped to achieve when we developed our protocols." That afternoon, Sandra arrived at my house carrying a folder of reports and a laptop computer. Her expression was curious as I led her through my home to the converted bedroom that served as my primary workspace. The room was equipped with multiple monitors, filing systems, and communication equipment that would have been familiar in any corporate office. "This is impressive," she said, looking around at the setup. "You really do run the entire company from home?" "I run it from wherever I happen to be," I corrected. "Technology has made location largely irrelevant for management functions. I can review reports, conduct staff meetings, and make policy decisions from anywhere with internet access." I showed her the dashboard systems I use to monitor real-time operations across all our facilities, from occupancy rates to staffing levels to resident satisfaction scores. The data was comprehensive and constantly updated, giving me visibility into every aspect of our business without requiring me to maintain a traditional corporate office. "How often do you visit the facilities in person?" Sandra asked. "Several times a year for each location," I said. "But I also conduct unannounced inspections, like the one I inadvertently performed at Sunset Manor last week." Sandra smiled at the reference. "That was certainly the most unusual facility tour I've ever conducted. I kept wondering why you seemed so knowledgeable about operational details." "I was knowledgeable because I designed those operational details," I said. "But I was also curious to see how they worked in practice when the participants didn't know they were being observed." We spent the next hour reviewing the issues Sandra had wanted to discuss, which centered on staffing challenges and resident care concerns that were common throughout the industry. Her questions were intelligent, and her proposed solutions were practical, confirming my positive impression of her management capabilities. "Sandra, I want you to know that your performance during last week's unusual circumstances was exemplary," I said as our meeting concluded. Managing a surprise inspection by the company owner while simultaneously dealing with a family conflict required considerable professional skill. "Thank you," she said. "I have to admit, I was terrified that I'd somehow failed a test I didn't know I was taking." "You weren't being tested," I assured her. "You were doing your job exactly as I hoped you would, and I was learning that my systems work well even under unexpected circumstances." After Sandra left, I found myself thinking about the various ways my recent revelation had affected the people around me. Michael was struggling to adjust his understanding of who I was and what our relationship should look like going forward. Sandra and her staff were grappling with the discovery that their owner had been evaluating them without their knowledge. Even Eleanor had expressed amazement at the scope of what I'd kept private for so many years. The secrecy that had once seemed like wise boundary setting was beginning to feel more like isolation. I'd protected my professional achievements from contaminating my personal relationships, but I'd also prevented the people I cared about from fully understanding who I was and what mattered to me. That evening, I called my attorney, Margaret Chen, to discuss some legal matters related to the business, but the conversation quickly turned to the personal implications of my recent revelations. "How are you feeling about everything that's happened?" she asked. "It can't be easy to have such a fundamental shift in your family relationships." "It's challenging," I admitted, "but it's also liberating. For the first time in decades, the people in my life know who I really am, rather than who they assumed I was." "And Michael? How is he adjusting to the new reality?" "Better than I expected," I said. "He's asking thoughtful questions and seems genuinely interested in understanding not just what I've accomplished, but why it mattered to me." "That's encouraging." Family relationships that survive this kind of revelation often become stronger because they're based on truth rather than assumptions. As we talked, I realized that Margaret was one of the few people who had always known the full scope of my professional life and personal values. Our attorney-client relationship had required complete honesty about my assets and objectives, and she'd never seemed surprised by the contrast between my modest lifestyle and substantial wealth. "Margaret, do you think I was wrong to keep my business success private for so long?" She was quiet for a moment before responding. "I think you made the choices that seemed right at the time based on the information you had available. But circumstances change, and sometimes the strategies that protected us in the past become limitations in the present." "You mean keeping my achievements secret made me vulnerable to people who underestimated my capabilities?" "Exactly. Michael's assumptions about your incompetence were based on incomplete information. If he'd known about Brooks Senior Care Services, he never would have tried to institutionalize you." The insight was accurate, but also somewhat troubling. I had maintained my privacy to protect my relationships from being contaminated by wealth and status, but that same privacy had enabled my son to treat me with fundamental disrespect. "So what do I do going forward?" I asked. "How do I maintain appropriate boundaries while ensuring that people understand my actual capabilities?" "You find a middle ground," Margaret said. "You don't have to publicize your wealth, but you also don't have to hide your competence. There's a difference between privacy and secrecy." Over the following weeks, I began implementing Margaret's advice, sharing selective information about my professional background with people whose assumptions about my capabilities affected their interactions with me. I wasn't announcing my wealth, but I was no longer pretending to be a helpless, elderly woman who needed management and protection. The process was surprisingly liberating. Conversations with neighbors became more interesting when they understood that I had professional expertise relevant to their concerns about aging parents. Interactions with service providers became more respectful when they realized I understood business practices and financial systems. Even casual social encounters were enhanced when people saw me as someone with valuable knowledge and experience, rather than someone who needed assistance with basic tasks. Michael and I had dinner together every week, gradually rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than assumed dependency. He told me about his architectural projects, and I shared insights from the senior care industry. Our conversations were more substantive and satisfying than they'd been in years. I keep thinking about what you said about independence being about choice rather than capability, he told me during one of these dinners. I'm starting to understand that what I thought was protection was actually elimination of choice. That's exactly right, I said. The most important gift you can give someone is the respect to make their own decisions, even when you disagree with those decisions. Even when those decisions involve risks I'm not comfortable with. Especially then, I said, because the alternative is to treat capable adults like children, and that's fundamentally dehumanizing. As autumn progressed, I found myself more engaged with both my business and my personal life than I'd been in years. The crisis that had threatened my independence had ultimately strengthened my sense of agency and clarified my priorities. I was no longer hiding my accomplishments or apologizing for my capabilities. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was professional as well. I began taking a more active role in industry organizations, sharing my perspectives on aging and independence with other senior care providers. My voice carried additional weight because people understood that my insights were based on both professional expertise and personal experience. You seem different lately, Eleanor observed during one of our regular coffee visits. More energetic, more engaged with everything. I feel different, I admitted. For years, I was managing multiple identities: successful businesswoman, devoted mother, modest neighbor, helpful friend. Now I'm just being myself, all of who I am, in every aspect of my life. And how does that feel? Authentic, I said simply. For the first time in decades, I'm not editing myself to fit other people's expectations or assumptions. The holiday season brought an opportunity to demonstrate this authenticity in a meaningful way. Michael invited me to spend Christmas Day with him and his girlfriend Rachel, whom I'd met only briefly in previous years. This time, however, our conversation was deeper and more substantive, because Michael had shared my story with her. I had no idea you were such an accomplished businesswoman, Rachel said as we prepared dinner together. Michael told me about your senior care company, and I looked up some articles about your work. You're something of a legend in the industry. The comment was gratifying because it came from someone who had no reason to flatter me. Rachel worked in healthcare administration, so she understood the significance of what Brooks Senior Care Services had accomplished in terms of improving industry standards and resident outcomes. I've been fortunate to build something meaningful, I said. But the real satisfaction comes from knowing that thousands of families have had better experiences during difficult times because we chose to do things differently. As we sat around Michael's dinner table, I reflected on how much had changed since the previous Christmas. A year ago, Michael had seen me as his aging mother, who might soon need assistance managing her declining capabilities. Now he saw me as a successful executive, who had chosen to live modestly while building a business empire that had transformed an entire industry. Mom, I have something I want to say, Michael announced as we finished our meal. I've been thinking about this for months, and I want to make sure I express it properly. Rachel looked curious, and I waited with interest to hear what he'd prepared. I want to apologize not just for what I tried to do, but for what I failed to see, he said. You raised me to be respectful and thoughtful, and then I treated you with casual disrespect based on stereotypes about elderly women. I failed as your son, and I failed as the person you taught me to be. The apology was more comprehensive than anything he'd said before, acknowledging not just his specific actions, but the fundamental failure of character they represented. Thank you for saying that, Michael. It means more than you know. I also want you to know that I've learned from this experience in ways that go beyond our relationship, he continued. I've been thinking differently about all the elderly people in my life, questioning assumptions I didn't even realize I was making. That's the most important outcome of all this, I said. If my experience helps you treat other people with greater respect, then something positive has come from a difficult situation. As the evening concluded, Rachel pulled me aside to express her own thoughts about the situation. I want you to know that watching Michael work through this has been impressive, she said. It takes real character to admit you've been fundamentally wrong about something so important. He's always had that character, I replied. He just needed a situation that required him to access it. Driving home that night, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond the resolution of our family conflict. Michael's growth and insight suggested that our relationship would not only survive this crisis, but emerge stronger and more authentic than it had been before. The new year brought opportunities to share my experience with other families facing similar challenges. I began writing articles for senior care publications about the importance of respecting elderly people's autonomy and avoiding assumptions about their capabilities based on age alone. Many adult children believe they're being helpful when they intervene in their parents' lives, I wrote in one piece. But help that isn't requested and doesn't address actual needs often becomes control that diminishes the very people it's meant to protect. The response to these articles was overwhelming, with letters from both elderly people who felt validated in their desire for independence and adult children who recognized their own assumptions in my descriptions of problematic family dynamics. One letter particularly moved me, from a woman whose son had been trying to force her to sell her home and move to assisted living despite her desire to remain independent. Reading your story gave me the courage to stand up for myself, she wrote. I hired my own attorney and established legal boundaries that protect my right to make my own decisions. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to fight for your dignity and win. The letter reminded me why the confrontation with Michael had been necessary despite its painful aspects. The principle of respecting elderly people's autonomy was larger than any individual family situation. By insisting on my right to self-determination, I had demonstrated that such insistence was possible and could be successful. As winter turned to spring, I found myself looking forward to each day with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt in years. My relationship with Michael continued to deepen as we learned to interact as equals rather than as parent and dependent child. My business continued to thrive as I brought renewed energy and focus to strategic planning and operational oversight. Most importantly, I had reclaimed my sense of agency and authority over my own life. The woman who had once hidden her accomplishments to avoid complicating her relationships had become someone who embraced the full scope of her identity and capabilities. The transformation was complete, but the story was far from over. Each day brought new opportunities to demonstrate that age and independence were not mutually exclusive, that respect and love could coexist without condescension, and that assumptions about elderly people's capabilities were often not just wrong but dangerously limiting. I had faced the ultimate challenge to my autonomy and emerged victorious, not through conflict but through the patient revelation of truth. The lesson was one I would carry forward. Sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated is simply to show people who you really are. 6 months after reclaiming my independence, I received an unexpected invitation that would test everything I'd learned about standing up for myself. The National Senior Care Association was hosting their annual conference in Denver, and they wanted me to deliver the keynote address on dignity and autonomy in an aging society. The invitation arrived on elegant letterhead with a personal note from the association president, Dr. Patricia Hammond, whom I'd known professionally for over a decade. Lena, she wrote, your recent articles about respecting elderly autonomy have sparked important conversations throughout our industry. We believe your perspective, informed by both professional expertise and personal experience, could help shape the future of how families and care providers approach these sensitive issues. I set the letter aside and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the garden I'd been tending for 40 years. The spring flowers were in full bloom, a testament to patience, consistent care, and the deep satisfaction that comes from nurturing something beautiful over time. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. I'd spent decades cultivating both a business and a life philosophy, and now I was being asked to share the fruits of that cultivation with a national audience. The speaking engagement represented more than professional recognition. It was an opportunity to transform my personal struggle into a broader conversation about aging, independence, and the complex dynamics between elderly parents and their adult children. But it also felt like stepping into a spotlight I'd spent decades avoiding. That evening, I called Michael to tell him about the invitation. His response was immediately enthusiastic, tinged with the pride that had replaced his earlier assumptions about my capabilities. Mom, that's incredible. The keynote address? Do you realize how significant that is? You'll be speaking to thousands of people who work in senior care. I'm aware of the scope, I said, amused by his excitement. But I'm also aware that accepting means sharing very personal experiences with a room full of strangers. Isn't that exactly what your articles have been doing? And look at the response you've gotten. People need to hear this message. He was right, of course. The articles I'd written had generated hundreds of letters from elderly people who felt validated in their desire for independence and from adult children who recognized their own problematic assumptions. But writing for publication felt different from standing on a stage and speaking directly to an audience about the most challenging period of my recent life. Michael, would you consider coming with me to Denver? Not because I need your permission or protection, but because I'd value your perspective as someone who lived through this experience from the other side. The pause before his answer was brief but meaningful. Are you sure you want me there? I wasn't exactly the hero of this story. You weren't the villain either, I said. You were someone who made assumptions based on incomplete information, and then had the courage to acknowledge your mistakes and learn from them. That makes you exactly the kind of person who should hear this message. 2 weeks later, we were sitting in my hotel room in Denver, reviewing the speech I'd prepared and discussing the questions I might face during the panel discussion that would follow my presentation. Michael had read through my draft and offered thoughtful suggestions about clarity and emotional impact. This section about the difference between protection and control is powerful, he said, pointing to a paragraph I'd struggled to write. But you might want to add something about the intentions behind paternalistic behavior. Most people who do what I did aren't trying to be cruel. They genuinely believe they're helping. That's a good point, I agreed. The road to loss of dignity is often paved with good intentions. The conference center was impressive, a sprawling complex designed to accommodate thousands of attendees from across the senior care industry. As we walked through the registration area, I was struck by the diversity of people in attendance. There were facility directors and care coordinators, family members and policy advocates, researchers and entrepreneurs, all united by their interest in improving the lives of elderly people. Mrs. Brooks? A young woman with a conference badge approached me with a bright smile. I'm Jennifer Martinez, the conference coordinator. We're so honored to have you as our keynote speaker. Is there anything you need before your presentation this afternoon? I think I'm well prepared, I said, though I felt the familiar flutter of nerves that preceded any important public appearance. Thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective. Thank you for being willing to speak so openly about such personal experiences, she replied. The advance registration for your session broke all previous records. People are eager to hear what you have to say. As we made our way to the main auditorium, I caught sight of the program listing my presentation, From Assumptions to Respect, One Family's Journey Toward Understanding Aging and Independence. Below my name was a brief biography that mentioned my role as founder of Brooks Senior Care Services, but focused primarily on my recent writings about elderly autonomy. The auditorium was larger than I'd expected, with seating for nearly 2,000 people. As attendees began filing in, I watched from the wings, noting the mix of ages and professional backgrounds represented in the audience. Some were young social workers and care coordinators just beginning their careers, while others were seasoned administrators and family members dealing with their own aging parents. Nervous? Michael asked, joining me at the edge of the stage. Focused, I corrected, though I appreciated his concern. This message matters too much for nerves to interfere with its delivery. Dr. Hammond approached to review the final details of my introduction and the format for the question and answer session that would follow. She was a distinguished woman in her 60s, someone whose own career had been built on advocating for innovative approaches to senior care. Lena, I want you to know that your willingness to share your personal experience is already having an impact, she said. We've received dozens of emails from conference attendees who say your story has made them reconsider their own assumptions about elderly family members. That's exactly what I hoped to hear, I replied. If my experience can prevent even a few families from going through what Michael and I experienced, then sharing it publicly will have been worthwhile. As the audience settled into their seats, I took a final look at my notes, though by now I could have delivered the speech from memory. The key points were clear in my mind. The danger of assumptions based on age stereotypes, the importance of respecting elderly people's decision-making capabilities, and the possibility of rebuilding relationships damaged by paternalistic interventions. Dr. Hammond's introduction was generous, highlighting both my professional achievements and my recent advocacy work. As she spoke, I felt a familiar calm settling over me, the same sense of purpose that had carried me through decades of business challenges and personal struggles. Please join me in welcoming Lena Brooks, she concluded, and I walked onto the stage to sustained applause from an audience I hoped was ready to have their assumptions challenged. I began with the scene that had started everything. Standing in my kitchen with a pill organizer, watching my son walk through my front door with two strangers who were planning to reorganize my life without consulting me. The audience was immediately attentive, recognizing the universal dynamics of family conflict around aging. In that moment, I said, I became invisible to my own son, not because he stopped loving me, but because he stopped seeing me as a competent adult capable of making my own decisions. I became a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be respected. I walked them through the assumptions Michael had made about my financial situation, my cognitive abilities, and my capacity for independent living. I described the casual efficiency with which he'd arranged my institutionalization, and the fundamental disrespect embedded in his failure to consult me about decisions that would reshape my entire life. The tragedy wasn't that Michael was trying to hurt me, I explained. The tragedy was that he genuinely believed he was helping me, and his good intentions blinded him to the fact that he was treating me with less respect than he would show a complete stranger. The audience was engaged, nodding in recognition of similar situations they'd witnessed or experienced. I could see understanding dawning on faces throughout the auditorium as people connected my specific experience to broader patterns of ageism and paternalism. Then I revealed the twist that had changed everything: my ownership of Brooks Senior Care Services, and the irony of Michael trying to force me into a facility I had personally designed and continued to operate. The gasp that rose from the audience was audible, followed by scattered laughter as people appreciated the perfect justice of the situation. The revelation of my business success was dramatic, I said. But it was also beside the point. Whether I was worth $500 million or $500 shouldn't have affected Michael's obligation to treat me with respect and include me in decisions about my own life. I spent considerable time discussing the difference between offering help and imposing solutions, between expressing concern and exercising control. Using examples from my own industry experience, I illustrated how the best senior care facilities empowered residents to make choices rather than making choices for them. Independence isn't about capability, I emphasized. Independence is about agency. It's about having the right to make decisions about your own life, even when those decisions involve risks that make other people uncomfortable. The audience was completely silent, absorbing not just my words but their implications for their own professional practice and family relationships. I could see people taking notes, mentally reviewing their own assumptions about the elderly people in their lives. I concluded with the lessons I'd learned from my confrontation with Michael, and the ongoing process of rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than assumed dependency. Love without respect is patronizing, I said in closing. Care without consent is control. If we truly want to help elderly people live with dignity, we must start by honoring their right to self-determination, even when their choices challenge our assumptions about what's best for them. The applause that followed was immediate and sustained, rising to a standing ovation that continued for several minutes. As I looked out at the audience, I saw not just professional appreciation but personal recognition. These were people who understood that my story wasn't just about one family's conflict, but about fundamental questions of human dignity and respect. Dr. Hammond joined me on stage for the question and answer session, and the questions that followed were thoughtful and challenging. A social worker asked how to balance respect for elderly autonomy with legitimate safety concerns. A facility administrator wanted guidance on empowering residents who had been conditioned to defer to authority figures. An adult daughter shared her own struggle with wanting to protect her aging father while respecting his independence. Each question gave me an opportunity to reinforce the central message that respect for elderly people's decision-making abilities must be the starting point for any discussion about care or safety. I emphasized that protecting someone's dignity was often more important than protecting them from every possible risk. My son thought he was protecting me from the dangers of living alone, I explained to one questioner. But what he was actually protecting me from was the right to choose how I wanted to live my own life. That kind of protection becomes indistinguishable from imprisonment. After the formal session ended, I was surrounded by conference attendees who wanted to share their own experiences and ask for additional guidance. The conversations were deeply personal, with adult children describing their struggles to find the right balance between concern and control, and elderly people expressing gratitude for having their desire for independence validated. One conversation particularly moved me. An elderly man named Robert approached with tears in his eyes, explaining that his daughter had been pressuring him to sell his home and move to assisted living, despite his desire to remain independent. "I've been feeling guilty for resisting her suggestions," he said. "She keeps telling me how worried she is, and I started to think maybe I was being selfish for wanting to stay in my own home. Your speech helped me understand that wanting to make my own decisions isn't selfish, it's human." "You're absolutely right," I told him. "And if your daughter loves you, she needs to learn to express her concern in ways that support your autonomy, rather than undermining it." Michael had watched the entire presentation from the audience, and when he joined me afterward, his expression was thoughtful and slightly emotional. "Mom, listening to you describe what I put you through was harder than I expected," he said. "But it was also important. I needed to hear how my actions affected you, not just logically, but emotionally." "How did it feel to hear your part of the story told to 2,000 strangers?" "Embarrassing," he admitted, "but also educational. I could see people in the audience recognizing their own behavior in your description of mine. If sharing our story prevents other families from going through what we went through, then the embarrassment is a small price to pay." That evening, we had dinner together in the hotel restaurant, debriefing from the day's events and discussing the broader implications of the message I'd delivered. Michael had been approached by several conference attendees who wanted to thank him for his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes publicly. A woman came up to me during the break and said that watching me in the audience gave her hope that her own son might eventually understand how his paternalistic behavior was affecting her, he told me. She said seeing that change was possible helped her feel less hopeless about their relationship. "That's exactly why I wanted you here," I said. "Your presence demonstrated that people can learn from their mistakes and rebuild relationships damaged by misguided good intentions." The conversation turned to the future and how we might continue sharing our story to help other families navigate similar challenges. Michael suggested that we consider writing a book together, combining my perspective as the elderly parent who fought back with his insights as the adult child who learned to change his approach. "I think there's value in showing both sides of this dynamic," he said. "Your voice provides the dignity and authority that elderly people need to hear, and my voice might reach adult children who are making the same assumptions I made." The idea was intriguing, though I wanted to be careful not to exploit our personal experience for commercial gain. "If we did something like that, it would need to be genuinely helpful rather than just profitable," I said. "Absolutely. And any proceeds could support organizations that advocate for elderly rights and family education." Over the following days, we received dozens of emails from conference attendees who wanted to share how our presentation had affected their thinking. A facility director wrote that she was revising her admission procedures to ensure that elderly people were active participants in decisions about their care, rather than passive recipients of arrangements made by their families. A geriatrician explained that he was changing how he conducted family conferences, making sure to address elderly patients directly rather than primarily communicating with their adult children. A policy advocate mentioned that she was incorporating our story into her testimony before state legislators, considering reforms to guardianship laws. The response was gratifying but also sobering. The insight pleased me because it suggested that Michael's growth extended beyond our specific conflict to a broader understanding of human dignity and respect. "That's exactly right," I said. "The moment we decide we know better than other competent adults about what's good for them, we stop treating them as equals." Our book project had evolved from a casual suggestion into a serious commitment. We'd been working with a literary agent who specialized in family memoirs and social issues, and several publishers had expressed interest in our story. The book would be structured as alternating chapters, with my perspective on experiencing paternalistic treatment balanced by Michael's insights into the assumptions and thought processes that had led to his intervention. "I want to be completely honest about how arrogant and condescending I was," Michael said as we reviewed the outline. "If adult children are going to learn from my mistakes, they need to see the full scope of what I got wrong. And I want to be honest about how angry and hurt I was," I replied. "Elderly people who are fighting for their autonomy need to know that those feelings are justified, and that it's possible to stand up for yourself successfully." The writing process was both cathartic and challenging. requiring us to revisit painful moments and examine them from multiple perspectives. But it was also healing, as we worked together to extract wisdom from our conflict and transform it into guidance that might help other families. One chapter that proved particularly difficult to write was my description of the afternoon when Michael brought Patricia and Jennifer to my house to present me with assisted living brochures. Reliving the humiliation and powerlessness I'd felt required me to access emotions I'd largely processed and moved beyond. "Reading your account of that day was gut-wrenching," Michael said after reviewing my draft. "I had no idea how demeaning my behavior was, or how it made you feel. I thought I was being helpful and considerate." "That's exactly why it needs to be included," I said. "Good intentions don't excuse harmful behavior, and people need to understand the emotional impact of paternalistic interventions." As autumn arrived, we received word that our book proposal had been accepted by a major publisher, with a substantial advance and a commitment to extensive marketing support. The publisher's enthusiasm was based partly on the uniqueness of our dual perspective, but mostly on the growing recognition that issues around aging and family dynamics would only become more relevant as the population continued to age. "This book has the potential to change how families approach these difficult conversations," our editor explained during our first meeting. "Your story provides both the emotional impact that motivates change and the practical guidance that makes change possible." The success of our advocacy work had an unexpected side effect. It brought me into contact with other elderly people who had successfully fought back against paternalistic treatment. I began corresponding with a network of what we jokingly called difficult elderly people, individuals who had refused to accept other people's assumptions about their capabilities. One member of this informal network was Dr. Elizabeth Warren, an 82-year-old retired surgeon, whose adult children had tried to force her to stop driving despite her perfect safety record and regular medical clearances. Another was James Chen, a 79-year-old widower whose son had attempted to take control of his finances after deciding that his father was too old to manage investments effectively. Each story was different in its details but similar in its core dynamics. Adult children making assumptions about their parents' declining capabilities, elderly people feeling disrespected and controlled, and family relationships damaged by interventions that were meant to be helpful but were experienced as patronizing. "What strikes me about all these stories," I wrote in an email to the group, "is how quickly family members jump to the conclusion that elderly people need management rather than support. It's as if reaching a certain age automatically disqualifies you from being treated as a competent adult." The responses to my observation were passionate and insightful. Dr. Warren pointed out that the same adult children, who wouldn't dream of overriding their elderly parents' religious or political beliefs, had no qualms about overriding their preferences about living arrangements or financial management. James Chen noted that his son regularly sought his business advice while simultaneously arguing that he was too old to manage his own investments. Our informal network began collaborating on articles and presentations about elderly autonomy, each contributing expertise from our various professional backgrounds. Dr. Warren wrote about medical decision-making and the importance of ensuring that elderly patients remain the primary decision-makers about their own care. James contributed insights about financial autonomy and the dangers of adult children gaining premature control over their parents' assets. My role in the group was to provide the business perspective and to serve as a liaison with the senior care industry. My ownership of Brooks Senior Care Services gave me credibility with facility administrators and policymakers who might otherwise dismiss elderly advocacy as self-interested complaining. "You have a unique platform," Dr. Warren observed during one of our video conference calls. "You can speak to industry professionals as a peer while speaking to elderly people as someone who has lived through what they're experiencing." The platform was powerful, but it also came with responsibilities I hadn't fully anticipated. As my public profile grew, I received increasing numbers of calls and emails from elderly people seeking advice about their own conflicts with adult children. Each request was heartbreaking and urgent, representing a family in crisis and an elderly person fighting for their dignity. I couldn't respond personally to every request, but I began developing resources that could help people advocate for themselves more effectively. Working with Margaret Chen, I created template letters that elderly people could use to establish legal boundaries with adult children who were overstepping their roles. I also compiled lists of attorneys who specialized in elder rights and understood the difference between legitimate protective interventions and paternalistic control. "You're building something important here," Margaret observed as we reviewed the latest batch of requests for help. A support network for elderly people who refuse to be treated as incompetent simply because of their age. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply satisfying. Each successful case of an elderly person reclaiming their autonomy felt like a small victory against the broader cultural assumption that aging inevitably leads to incompetence and dependency. One case that particularly gratified me involved a 78-year-old woman named Dorothy, whose daughter had been trying to force her to sell her home and move across the country to be closer to family. Using the template letters and legal resources I'd provided, Dorothy was able to establish clear boundaries and retain control over her living situation while maintaining a loving relationship with her daughter. "Your materials gave me the language I needed to explain that wanting to stay in my own home wasn't stubbornness," Dorothy wrote in a thank you letter. "My daughter finally understood that I was making a thoughtful decision based on my own priorities, not just being difficult." As winter approached, our book neared completion, and we began preparing for the publicity campaign that would accompany its publication. The publisher had arranged interviews with major media outlets, speaking engagements at conferences in universities, and book signings in cities across the country. "Are you ready for this level of public attention?" Michael asked as we reviewed the promotional schedule. "Once the book is published, your story will be much more widely known." I considered the question seriously. Public attention had never been something I sought, and my preference had always been to work behind the scenes rather than in the spotlight. But the response to my conference presentations and articles had convinced me that visibility was necessary to achieve the broader cultural change I hoped to promote. "I'm ready," I said. "The message is too important to worry about personal comfort." The book launch was scheduled for spring, timed to coincide with National Senior Citizens Month and several major conferences on aging and family dynamics. Early reviews had been overwhelmingly positive, with critics praising both the emotional honesty of our story and the practical guidance we provided for families facing similar challenges. One review that particularly pleased me appeared in the Journal of Elder Law. Brooks and her son have created a roadmap for transforming family conflict into family growth. Their willingness to share their most painful experiences serves the broader goal of helping other families avoid similar mistakes and rebuild damaged relationships. As the publication date approached, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. 2 years earlier, I had been an elderly woman whose son thought she needed institutional care. Now I was a nationally recognized advocate for elderly rights, co-author of a book that publishers expected to influence policy discussions, and founder of a growing network of resources for elderly people fighting for their autonomy. The transformation hadn't been easy or comfortable, but it had been necessary. By refusing to accept Michael's assumptions about my capabilities, I had not only preserved my own independence, but created opportunities to help countless other elderly people preserve theirs. "You know what I'm most proud of?" Michael asked during one of our final editing sessions for the book. "What's that?" "That you didn't let my ignorance and arrogance diminish you. You could have accepted my version of who you were and what you needed, but instead you insisted on being seen as who you actually are. That took incredible courage." "It took incredible necessity," I corrected. "I couldn't live with being treated as less than I was, so I had to find the strength to demand better. And in the process, you've made it easier for other people to make the same demand." As I prepared for the book tour and the increased public attention it would bring, I felt confident that the message we were sharing would resonate with audiences across the country. The issues we'd experienced weren't unique to our family. They reflected broader cultural assumptions about aging that needed to be challenged and changed. The story that had begun with my son bringing strangers into my kitchen to plan my life without consulting me had evolved into a national conversation about dignity, respect, and the right of elderly people to self-determination. It was a conversation long overdue, and I was honored to help lead it. Standing in my kitchen where it all began, looking out at the garden I'd tended for decades, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal vindication. I had transformed a painful family conflict into a platform for social change, And in the process, I had discovered strengths and capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. The elderly woman who had once been seen as a problem to be solved had become a voice for solutions that honored the dignity and autonomy of aging people everywhere. It was a role I embraced fully, knowing that the work was far from finished but confident that meaningful change was not only possible but inevitable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.